Last October, on the trip to the Near East in Shechem, the famous Samaritan town, I put out some dough. I'm not sure whether I spent it wisely or not, but this is supposed to be a clay lamp that dates from the time of King David. I'm not an expert on such things. The reason I put out the dough this time and not normally is I think it probably is. Tomorrow I'm having lunch with a friend who is an archaeologist and an expert, and he's going to look at it for me to see whether or not it is and make some recommendations about it. If it isn't, it's worth the money I spent for such a clever forgery. It is gorgeous. Now, why do I show it? Well, partly because for the junior highs, I brought a number of clay lamps and coins and things along to talk about the Bible and show how these were real people. And today we're going to redo something that I haven't done for 3 or 4 years. Take a good hard look in a little different kind of a sermon at the 23rd Psalm. Traditionally a Psalm of David. And if we might transpose ourselves back to the time of David, 1000 BC, 3,000 years ago, this is our touchstone. And we wave and we mark our magic lantern, and poof, traveled 5,000 miles, 3,000 years, and we're sitting in a quiet place listening to the Psalm of David. Now, in the pews, there are your Bibles, and I hope that you may turn to one and find the 23rd Psalm, page 429, and follow along with me. And there should be some up here to share. Another one. The pagans at that end of the earth. Okay. 429. The Psalm of David, Psalm 23, is perhaps the most famous of all psalms. It's the psalm that everybody is at some time or another required to learn, to memorize, to work on. It's used, it's recited, it has a tremendous amount of background to it. And periodically I take it and work it through rather carefully, and I'm always amazed at how new things come to light. Most of you were not here at the time we did the 23rd Psalm before, so that you won't find too much repetition, obviously. And those of you who were here when we did it before will probably, like me, remember things and also see some new things. So on a different kind of a sermon, traveling back with him, we do not know whether this was the Psalm of David or not. It's traditionally that it was. The Lord is my shepherd. Whenever you find in the Old Testament the concept that the Lord is, you have to recognize that we are dealing with the name of God according to the Hebrew tradition. Many of the new translations of the Bible are more accurately saying Yahweh, W-A-H-W-E-H, Yahweh, for there is no such thing as the Lord. God had a name in the biblical record. We don't have that. We have small g and capital G. Small g for all other gods and capital G for the one God we worship. The Hebrews probably had something similar to that in the name El. El means God, and a small e in English, but a capital E would be El, the name of God. There are many names for God in the Bible. Many of them are attributes of God. El Shaddai, El Konah, El, a whole host of things. God of righteousness, God of mercy, God of jealousy. A jealous God is he. But when God reveals himself specifically to Moses in the Sinai desert, he gives himself a name, and that name is Yahweh. We don't know what it means. The normal translation is, I am that I am, or I who caused to be, or I am the one who exists. But the name is Yahweh. Talked about that before a number of times, and I won't dwell upon it, but we ought to recognize that Yahweh is the word there. It is a specific name of the God of Israel. If that's the case, where does the concept of Lord come in? Well, from about the 2nd century BC on, the Jews refused to pronounce the name of God. To pronounce the name of God in Jewish understanding meant that he was present. To pronounce the name of the evil one, and much of the myth and folklore of the world means that he's present. Don't say his name. That means he's here. You call him there. Consequently, because they were afraid that they might call upon God in vain and thereby break the commandments, they refused to pronounce his name. Today they do one of two things. They say Hashem, which is Hebrew for the name, or they say Adonai, which is my Lord. In ancient times, rather than say Yahweh, they would always say Adonai, my Lord. When the Christians took over the translation and began to work with the Bible, they didn't know what to do with Yahweh. And instead of just transliterating it from one script to another and calling it Yahweh, they took over the Hebrew concept of Lord and therefore translated Lord. The Lord is my shepherd strictly is Yahweh is my shepherd. I think a second thing that we ought to point out in that little phrase is extremely interesting because shepherds and shepherding are becoming more of a fascination for me. This is strictly not a noun. It's a participle. What does a participle mean over and above a noun? Well, a noun has all kinds of things. There are various kinds of nouns, but a participle noun is a noun which is active. And I think if we just read this as a shepherd, we have a vision of some poor individual sitting out a field watching his flocks. Nothing could be farther from the truth than the concept of the shepherd in the Near East. The shepherd is not a passive individual who sits on his haunches watching the flocks, but is an active individual who is responsible for his flocks. In ancient times, a shepherd had to bear the responsibility for every single one of his flock, and if one was to be lost, he had to pay for it out of his own salary, unless he could prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was killed by a wild animal. Much as 75 years ago, there was a lion spotted in the Near East. There were lions and bears there until civilization drove them out and caused them to die off and be exterminated. And if you could show and bring back the tattered ear or the tattered leg of one of the sheep, you would be able to prove that it was not your responsibility. The wild animals had gotten it, and therefore you didn't have to pay for it. Now, the idea of a shepherd as an active individual, I think, is significant when you talk about God. God is somebody who is actively involved in the relationship with his people. It is not a passive relationship, sitting back and saying, oh, wait until you come unto me, and then I'll give you rest. He seeks out his own. The New Testament utilizes throughout the picture of Jesus as the good shepherd, the one who reaches out to his people, the one who seeks out the 99 or the 100 that is lost, allowing the others to stay together, but going out and finding them. The picture of the New Testament in John is a picture of an individual who knows his sheep, and his sheep know him. You'll remember the story, which is not understandable unless you know something of the Near East. That the shepherd goes and he calls out to his sheep and they recognize his voice and they come out. What does that mean? Well, in the ancient Near East and even to this day, you'll find that all the sheep are put into a common pen for the keeping at night. Instead of having individual during the winter months or during the months when they're not out in the field, instead of having individual watchmen, which is not only costly but very difficult to do, all the sheep were brought together, penned together from all of the various flocks, and one individual watched over them at night. Then in the morning, how do you separate the sheep? Sometimes wonder that when I see tour buses, 5 busloads of people going somewhere, how they separate the sheep and never get them moving on the right bus again. God help them, you know. 1,000 people Pat Boone traveled with. Can you imagine trying to herd 1,000 people around? I have trouble with 18. Like 18 or 20 is the maximum for me. Now, how do you do it? Well, the shepherd steps out and speaks. And the sheep recognize his voice and come to him. So the shepherds stand around at various points and just call out, and the sheep follow him. Now there's another beautiful example here. Not only is Yahweh my shepherd, one who is actively involved in my life and actively seeking, but he recognizes my call. And if I am true to understanding what he means in my life, I recognize him in my life. One of the most difficult things I think people face when they try to understand God in life is, how do you know what's the voice of God and what's the voice of my own conscience or lack of it? You ask yourself that question all the time if you're ever thinking about, what would God have me do? What is God and what is me? Because I can con myself into almost anything. Rationalize it and justify it. raising a son that can do the same thing. It's frightening to watch. He's so good at it, he's almost better than I am. He blew it yesterday. Took off with his friend. Not only when his mother had just gone to the store and said, "Now don't leave the yard," they broke into the house, friend's house, just to see if they could in case they ever had to, and then took off for the local shopping center where, lo and behold, they bumped into the mother who wasn't supposed to be there, crossing main streets and the whole bit. Well, fortunately, the nice thing about having two parents is sometimes things which are serious to one aren't serious to the other. I remember doing that kind of a thing, so I couldn't get too upset. Chris was a little more upset. She came down like the wrath of the shepherd upon this poor lamb, and he was led to the slaughter. Oh, Dad, it was such an experience. When I have children, I'll be able to teach them how to cross the street safely because I've done it. Mother, you've heard people say, "I lost my mind. I don't know what made me do it. I just lost my mind. I just couldn't control myself." Well, these are all after facts. The truth of the matter is he never thought about it beforehand, and he's looking for all kinds of excuses. And he's got a good story, and it depends on what the story is, and he can bring tears to your eyes as he tells it. Because they're flowing out of his tears, and he was taking a bath last night, sobbing away, floating with his ears underwater so that he could shout at you, but he couldn't hear you shouting back. I walked in there, I almost drowned the kid. "I'm going to baptize you," whoom, kind of thing. Well, how does he know the voice of the Lord as opposed to that old kind of thing working within his mind? It's difficult. Practice, in a sense. The shepherd and the sheep get together, they spend time together, they talk together, and they follow. Sheep are not very nice. Sheep are dirty animals. They're dumb as can be. They have to be led to water and to food. They don't seek it out and find it themselves. And yet they're trusted. And maybe in that sense, there's a sense in which as we compare ourselves to God and try to understand God, no matter how clever, smart, and sharp we are much like sheep. In comparison to Him, we are not clean. We are not intelligent. We need to be led and guided. And we need to spend time hearing the voice. So Yahweh, my shepherd, actively participating in my life and working with me to improve it. Okay, I shall not want is a terrible translation because in American English today, want is something that you don't necessarily need, but you got to have. And there are an awful lot of people who still take that in that sense. There are whole religious groups that say you won't want anything. Anything that you want is going to come your way. If you watch television, you'll see some of the groups. I was poor and I followed God and suddenly I became rich. Wealth came my way, power, I'm now driving X and X car, whatever the happy car of that particular group happens to be, and now money is pouring in. It's not what the biblical concept is, because the Bible constantly deals with not the outer desires, but the inner needs. I think a better translation at this point, and many New Testament or Old Testament scholars are moving towards it, and some are even translating that way at this point, is the Lord, or Yahweh my shepherd, I shall not lack. Now that's a tremendously different kind of a thing. There are a lot of things I want. I would like to have many, many hundreds of dollars to buy things like this. I'd like to have a room with all this stuff around and be able to take students and kids and you and everybody through and hand it to you and let you feel 3,000 years old. Or 3 hours as the case may be, but let's say 3,000 years old and hold it. I want things like that. I'd like to buy a widow's mite, the little coin from the time of Jesus that's now selling for about $80. The widow would have been wealthy if she had a few mites and could sell them in today's market. There are a lot of things I would want. But when you begin to look at it, there are very few things that I lack because the impact of this particular thing is that as Yahweh is my shepherd, I reestablish my priorities and reestablish my understanding of life so that my wants aren't the important thing, but where I am is important. And the significant thing about it is that I lack nothing, even though I may apparently seem to lack it. I have the ability under God, listening to His voice, to put it into a proper perspective. Now that's tough. That's the toughest and easiest thing to talk about and the toughest thing to do in all of life. To take what's happening in your life and to see it not as a lack, but as something with which you are growing and therefore a positive thrust. Now that's tough. When you learn to take the upheavals and the things that are breaking loose and all unraveling in your life and to put it in a sense, in touch with and godly and understanding and hearkening to God's voice, following the active shepherd, and can see it as a positive thrust, you understand this verse. Yahweh, my active shepherd, compelling me in certain directions. There is no lack. I still may have my own needs and desires and wants, but I lack nothing. I am complete. And that's what peace is, as we've talked about. The wholeness, the completeness, the oneness of mind, body, and spirit. Okay. If at any point anything doesn't make sense or you got something to throw in, shout out. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. There are a lot of things that we can say at that particular point. Causes me to crouch down, but I don't think we understand green pastures in the Near Eastern mind unless you've been there. I'm reading, by the way, one of the most fascinating books in D and the Mannings. You ought to read it. Mark Twain's The Innocents Abroad. It's a travel published first in 1869 of Mark Twain taking a trip through Europe, which is fun, and then into the Near East. You have never in your life seen the Near East except through his eyes, and you suddenly recognize that you did see it. He has a whole different concept because he's dealing with the Near East not out of the modern mechanized air-conditioned bus that's traveling at 50 and 60 miles an hour, but from the back of an old broken-down mule. We drove in a matter of 2 or 3 hours from Jerusalem up to northern Galilee, Capernaum, all in one day. He's sitting in the Capernaum, the village of Capernaum, and saying it's several days' journey to Jerusalem. How did Jesus move back and forth so often? It's a several days' journey. It is. It's 120 miles. On foot, at least 5 days. And probably more, because you don't normally make 25 miles a day. Fascinating kind of a thing. He talks about going through, doesn't even mention the psalm, going through Syria, the wilderness, the desert, the complete lack of anything green for mile after mile after mile, and suddenly hitting northern Galilee, and there are green fields. He said, we kicked up the horses and ran just for the sheer joy of seeing it. Now, when you look at this particular psalm, you have to understand that as you move through life and the wilderness, God ultimately causes you to lie down in the green pastures. You come out of the desert, you come out of the wilderness, you come out of the area where there's no water for mile after mile after mile after mile after mile, and suddenly you hit for the first time greenness. And it shocks you. It takes your breath away. That kind of a thing, because as you look at your own life, regardless of what is happening in it, under God is the power to find and to live in the green pastures, lacking not in the desert around. He leads me beside the still waters, he restoreth my soul. That's difficult. Quiet waters, the waters, tranquil waters. Out of the storms of life comes suddenly an opportunity to sit down in the peace and the quiet. I think of life not so much as being storm on one hand and peace and quiet on the other hand, but as being a tornado with an eye. Inside the eye of the hurricane, inside the eye of the hurricane is quiet, even though you recognize the storms are going on around us, and that if you want to move, you may have to take the chance of getting into the storm. I don't know whether that's helpful to you or not, but it is to me. My life at times is tranquil and peaceful because I recognize that under God, with God as my shepherd, I can do anything, and I can even move through the storm. And I recognize the storm's going around, but first I start off with the inner peace, and then I can take the chance of breaking out and fighting with the storms. I can, in a sense, create tranquil waters. Now, the restoring of my soul is an interesting one. That's a terrible translation, but it depends on how you ultimately see this whole psalm. Do you see it as something affecting the here and now as we are talking about it, or as something in the future? Soul is not a Hebrew word. It's a Greek word. It's a word that comes into our language, and we get into problems with it even in the New Testament. What should it profit a man if he should gain the whole world and lose his what? Soul. Life. Being are three of the translations which grow out of the separate Gospels themselves, reflecting the difficulty of the Greek. Now the thing is that it's one word in the Hebrew, nephesh. The nephesh means, in a sense, the soul, the existence, life, the total being. What God is restoring to me is not some sort of a part of my existence that you can't see, i.e. my soul that's being restored in heaven somewhere, but my very existence, and see the picture. You come out of the desert. You are being led by the shepherd. You are finding the green pastures. You are by the still waters. Regardless of what's happening in the storms of your life, you are being returned to your very existence yourself. I see it as very much a here and now kind of an expression. Suddenly, regardless of where I've been, I no longer am going to laugh because I've established the correct priorities. I've reformed my life, which means repent in the biblical sense. I am acknowledging God, Yahweh, my shepherd, and I'm finding the tranquil waters, and myself is being restored to me. I'm becoming a whole person again. I am finding peace. Peace which comes only from a total recognition of the oneness with God and oneness within. Because he asked me if I was going to cover the whole psalm, and I said, oh yeah, probably twice through, and I haven't even got through the first 3 verses yet.
In modern usage, is that the soul?
Right. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. It's probably all the farther we get today, but that's all right. We may do chapter 2 the next time through. He leads me in the paths of righteousness. What does that mean? Spent some time working on this over the week and trying to figure it out, and I think there are 2 or 3 things that we can say. I don't like the word paths. Paths are sort of wandering kinds of things. What they mean here are ruts, grooves. I had a chance to visit in October for the first time Jerish, one of the ancient Roman ruins. Absolutely gorgeous room. Fascinating. You go down these sort of cobblestone streets, and there you find a manhole cover. They had a beautiful system for draining off the rain down underneath, and the manhole's still there, and it's still working, the system. But the thing that catches your eyes as you're standing there along this long colonnade with the Roman columns on both sides, leading to the amphitheater and finally up to the temple and all of that, is in the solid rock are grooves. Cut right into the rock. I asked our guide, Abraham, I said, what are those grooves? He said, those are the wagon and chariot grooves from ancient times. Now, we've just gotten through a winter. It wasn't an easy winter, but in many ways it was easier than last winter. We didn't have quite as much snow at any one time. But you've been up and down the roads, and you know exactly what it is. The first car through cuts a track. Second car through follows that track, and by the time the thing goes on, everybody's in the same track. Even if that track, as it is in the house across from us, is across their front lawn, because the road curves funny, and people don't know it, and they cut across this way. Then it rains a little bit and gets hard, and you get caught in the track, and another car is coming the other way in the same track, and you both are sitting there saying, how am I going to get out of this track? Right? Because as it gets cut deeper and then gets icy, you can turn the wheels and do anything you want, and you just keep plowing right straight on ahead. Now, in a sense, that's what they're talking about here. The word itself literally is wagon tracks rather than paths. It's the deep-cut grooves coming down. And the implication is that as you are moving along, you get yourself not in a rut, which is a bad word in English, but it means that, so much in a rut that when you are dealing with life, you react in a righteous manner because that is your what? Precisely. It's your habit. You can't do anything else. You're caught in it. You see one of the problems that we have, and you recognize it in your own life over and over again, is that you do want to make decisions on a moral basis, but only in specific cases. We've been talking for months now about the whole idea of living a moral life and how you approach it, and various principles and understanding of time and a whole host of other things, which means that you have to continually practice so that when a crisis comes, you know how to handle it. Not that you have to stop and think about it, but you're on such a rut of righteousness that you can't do anything else but. That's what the implication is here. I've used it over and over again, but I hope you'll forgive me if I say it this time. When you're learning to drive a car, you don't learn to hit the brakes after you've learned to drive 70 miles an hour. It's the first thing you learn. You get to the point where you hit the brakes automatically. You never stop and say, no, I ought to be stopping. What was the rule for stopping at this point, and how do I stop? Because when a crisis situation comes, you hit the brakes without thinking. It's part of the automatic response that you build into your existence. The moral life is no different. It takes that kind of automatic response. It takes that kind of practice. It takes that kind of understanding over and over and over again so that when the moral crunch hits you, you're not sitting there saying, oh, what am I supposed to do? You automatically are caught in the groove of it. The bowler likes a good groove. The whole difference between a good bowler in championship flight and a good bowler who isn't championship but has an occasional good game is that the good bowler hits the groove all the time. He's gotten to the point that he's almost mechanical with that stroke. A good golfer, the difference between Jack Nicklaus and Bill Borglund, aside from 20 strokes, and the 20 strokes are due to one thing. Jack Nicklaus hits the groove. He's got the swing, and you talk about it, and you talk about it, and you practice, and you get out there and you just keep hitting it, you know. Those of you who are golfers know that you never hit your irons and your woods the same way, which is why most people hit either a good iron or a good wood, but they don't hit them both. It's two totally different swings. And you get the groove for your woods, and you're out there one day grooving it, driving that ball straight down the middle of your 225 yards and can't hit an iron at all. Why? Because it's a different groove. Now what you've got to do is you get into it. You get to the point where it's automatic. You don't stop and think. The worst thing you can do is try to teach somebody else how to play golf. I used to do that. I could sit up there and hit the ball all day, had control, knew exactly what I was doing until I tried to teach somebody else. And then to twist their hand, I was twisting, dropping shoulders, hitting the ground, doing everything else. My game went absolutely to pot because I was so conscious of what I was saying to help them to get their groove that I was overdoing it myself, and I lost the natural kind of a feeling. Well, He leads me in the grooves, the ruts of righteousness. That is, He teaches me in such a way that as I go down through life, I'm caught in the righteous ways because of Him. For His name's sake. We've entered into the philosophical discussion down through the ages that God doesn't need anything. That is not biblical. That is not biblical at all. It has nothing to do with the Bible. We've entered into a philosophical discussion that God is complete within Himself and doesn't have any responsibilities. He just does things of His own free will. That's not true. The biblical record is over and over and over again that God has an ongoing relationship with man and responsibilities for that relationship with man and obligations on because of that relationship with man. And He does things because He must do them. It's not optional. Now, with all of our talk of freedom, I think there's a point where we ought to stop doing a little talking about freedom and start dealing and talking about the responsibility. God has responsibilities towards us, and He has promised. We'll see it next week when we talk about kindness, mercy, loving kindness, whatever that word means. He has promised us that if we do certain things, He will do them. Yahweh, my shepherd, I shall not lack, causes me to crouch down in the lush green pastures. leads me beside the tranquil waters, returns my existence, my soul, my very being unto me. He leads me in the paths of righteousness, the ruts of righteousness, for the sake of his name. Well, next week we pick up, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup overflows. What does that mean? Why? Surely goodness and hesed, mercy, loving kindness, covenant love, responsibility, obligation, all words that could be used there, shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Perhaps during the course of the week you may take a chance to meditate upon the psalm. And we'll pick up with verse 4 as we continue with the Psalm of David from 1000 BC. Yahweh, my shepherd. May you live a righteous life, not because it's